Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. Again, my name's Jay Miro, and I'm a senior resource planner at the King Conservation District. So tonight we'll be talking about soil testing, but first we like to, on soil health, first we like to introduce ourselves. So I'm a senior resource planner, and I've worked for the Conservation District for 24 and a half years. So pretty much most of my career has been here, and I've been managing the soil test program for the last 10 or 12 years. In addition to doing the soil tests and presentations like this, I work a lot with farmers out in rural King County, helping them balance their goals with natural resource issues. So I'll pass it over to Megan.
All right, great. Thanks, Jay. Maybe while I'm talking, you can pull up the presentation while I'm blabbering away. But my name's Megan. Jay and I are both on the farm team. So we both help rural residents in the county steward natural resources. And I've worked for the district for about 7.5 years now. We need to throw Jay a big party when he hits 25 years soon. But as we were doing our work and helping our community and talking with people, we realized that there was a bit of a need or continued help and questions around soil health. So we kind of created this presentation. So hopefully you all find it helpful. Me and Jay are going to kind of take turns with different sections of the presentation. So if you want to flip to the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the outline and KCD, and we'll kind of jump into it. So just for an outline, so you know what to expect tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about what the King Conservation District is, a brief history of soil conservation. We're going to touch a little bit on soil basics, soil basics 101 and soil health. And then we're going to jump into deciphering soil testing, our soil testing program, and how to collect samples, and then how to understand soil test results. And then talking about how to actually use that information and improve your soil fertility for a variety of reasons. So the King Conservation District's mission is to promote the sustainable use of natural resources through the responsible stewardship for both city dwellers and rural residents alike. There are a few cities that don't fund or pay into our rates and charges. So every parcel in King County pays a small property tax fee that you'll see on your property tax information. And that funds the work that we do. A few cities in our county have opted out, including Pacific, Skykomish, Federal Way, Milton, Enumclaw. Who am I missing? I think I got it. So we aren't able to help in those areas. However, you can talk to your city councilman and let them know that you would like to support us, and they could consider that adding us to your property taxes. We have a board of about 5 or 6 board members that oversee our agency. If you're not in King County, I definitely encourage you to look into your conservation district. Every county in the state has a conservation district, and all of our services vary a little bit, but they're all great services for you. Sometimes people call us the best kept secret in the county because we're a small district of about 20 to 30 people. And so sometimes we're mostly spread through word of mouth. So if you know of anyone that you think could use our services, I would definitely encourage you to let your neighbors or your friends know about us. So I call this my shameless plug for our KCD programs, but we also offer a variety of things for the community, including free soil testing program, which we'll talk more about today. We have a native plant sale, which is really popular, education and volunteer programs. We have shoreline riparian habitat enhancement and conservation reserve easement program, forest health programs, and wildfire resiliency programs, which, considering what just happened in California, people are recognizing really the importance around having a wildfire, protected home and residents, community agriculture, and the work that we do, farm conservation management, ag drainage. We have an equipment rental program, and then we have a whole host of grant programs that give out funding to fund all kinds of important work in the community, and a cost share program.
So I'm going to talk about how conservation started. And soil erosion has been a huge part of history. And idea of the conservation district was created out of a national catastrophe, not only an environmental problem, but also a human catastrophe that occurred in the Midwest in the 1930s. And of course, I'm talking about the Dust Bowl. So the Dust Bowl was this great or soil erosion problem where billions of tons of soil blew all throughout the country, mostly forming in the panhandle of Texas, in Oklahoma, and Kansas. And it was a problem due to kind of a combination of factors. You know, folks moved to a part of the country after, folks were displaced from their native homeland, and they found the area was perfect for growing wheat. It was just wet enough that the area could be planted and cultivated. And also at the same time, John Deere invented his tractor, which really mechanized the conversion of prairie into crop field. And if any of you have traveled in the Midwest, you'll notice one thing: it's awfully windy. So at the time, parts of the prairie were getting plowed and people were moving there. The area was getting developed and settled. And while wheat prices were high after World War I, it seemed like the prairie was just going to be tamed. And there was a saying that they used to use is rain followed the plow. And of course, that's not quite the way it works in real life. And so as settlers came and churned up the prairie and planted wheat, it seemed like, the world was their oyster. However, the climate and a drought kind of came over back into the Midwest. Midwest is not normally wet enough to support wheat, so the settlers had moved there during this little climatological anomaly. And so the drought settled in or returned to the area, and wheat wasn't able to grow. And so there was millions of acres of cropland that had once been covered in prairie grasses, now had been exposed to the winds of the Midwest. And all that topsoil blew. And not only, right, this was a human issue where people moved to an area, now their homes were destroyed, their livelihoods were ruined, and they either lost their lives, and certainly some of them were forced to relocate, but also the billions of tons that were eroded from the landscape. And so the idea was that in order to protect the nation, the government felt like they had to do something. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt said it best: the nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And the idea that they came up with was pretty innovative for the time. They realized that they couldn't create laws in Washington, D.C. that would really get farmers in Kansas and Oklahoma, Texas. They wouldn't be able to tell them how to farm. And so they decided to create local soil districts. And the conservation district system was born with an idea is that we'd have local people, and that was the board members that Megan kind of alluded to. Those board members would be the people that would help determine what makes sense in each area. Districts were formed mostly around county boundaries, but we don't need to follow them. And some districts cover multiple counties, and some counties have multiple districts. But the idea was that we had this local group of farmers, and at the time it was all farmers. Nowadays we have folks that are interested in salmon, folks that are interested in natural resources, as well as folks that have farming interests. But it would be those people that would help determine the activities that each district participates in. And at the time, there was a federal presence in each district. It was called the Soil Conservation Service. And if an area created a district, the federal government would install one of these soil conservation offices. And so we still work with them today. They're a partner in all of our conservation activities. But over time, districts have been able to find funding and staff to do some of the work ourselves. And so nationwide, there's over 3,000 conservation districts. And in Washington state, we have 45.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jay. Yep. So then we really can't talk about how to amend your soil and everything without just kind of a basic understanding about soils. So we're going to jump into that. This could be a whole course, college course in itself. We're just going to give you a quick basic snapshot about what soil is. Hopefully that will help make sense with everything going forward. So at the most basic level, what soil is the mineral content. So that's the content we see. It's that rock that has eroded over millions and millions of years into this fine sediment. And then in between that space in the mineral, around those minerals that have broken down and eroded, are water and air, which, as we know, are what plants need to grow. And then within that there's also organic matter. And we're going to talk more about organic matter in a few slides. But that's essentially the source of most of our nutrients for our plants that we want to grow in our soil. So from there, we kind of jump into soil texture. So there's three basic soil sizes. There's sand, which is the largest particle size and has the least water holding capacity or ability to hold nutrients in soil. So when you think about like the sand at the beach, after the ocean recedes back, when the tide goes out, how quickly that sand dries up, it's not very good at holding water. And also has large pore space. So essentially the space around the sand particles is large. And then silt is kind of that Goldilocks perfect size of medium-sized particles. And then clay is teeny, really tiny particle sizes, closely spaced together, and not a lot of space for air because they can be so tightly clustered together. And so when you look over on that image on the right, you can really depict just the discrepancy or the spectrum of sizes for soil. You have gravel, sand, silt, and then clay, which is invisible at that scale. And so within that, soil scientists have developed this triangle of soil textures where depending on your soil type, you have different percentages of sand, silt, and clay. In a perfect world, we would all get lucky and have a beautiful, loamy, silty soil type where we live, because that's the most productive because it's got all those different mixtures of particle sizes, texture. Loam is that mixture of different texture sizes. So you've got a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. So that's just kind of the term for that. And loam is it's that ideal soil type that we could all have if we had a choice, because it's the most productive soil, and it'll make sense hopefully a little bit more after we explain a little bit more about soil properties, about why that is. Soil health. So just touching on this a little bit, soil health is the capacity of soil to function as a living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. We're learning even more and more about what soil can do, but we know that it can retain and recycle nutrients, support plant growth, sequester carbon, allow the infiltration and filtration of water. Healthy soil can suppress pests, disease, and weeds. It can even detoxify chemicals. It supports our food, fuel, and fiber economies and provides habitat. So just touching on soil health practices here for a moment, this in itself could be a whole presentation, but we just wanted to give you kind of the four main principles of soil health in terms of when you're managing soil where you live. The first thing you want to do is minimize disturbance. In a farm setting, that would mean trying to avoid plowing your soil every year or doing anything to make a big disturbance of pulling that soil up. Maximizing biodiversity, maintaining living roots, and maximizing soil cover. So essentially anything you can do to keep that soil from eroding and staying in place is really important for soil health, and having those living roots is really important to soil structure, also preventing soil erosion and a whole host of other things. So in the soil science world, one does not simply call soil dirt. Soil is a dynamic natural body composed of mineral and organic solids, gases, liquids, and living organisms, which can serve as a medium for plant growth. So this slide is kind of a joke because in the soil world, dirt is literally a dirty word. It's like not said. So you will not see the word dirt in this presentation. So hopefully after you leave this presentation, you just refer to our ecosystem on the ground as soil. Okay, so soil organic matter, kind of jumping into this, that 5% of what makes up our total soil, you have the fresh residue. So in the fall, that's a perfect example when all the leaves are falling off the trees, landing on the ground, and they've got this fresh residue there. The bacteria and the fungi and the soil biota get to work, and they start decomposing that organic matter and integrating into the soil profile. And that's going to be your decomposing organic matter. Or also like grass clippings is a great example of that when you mow your lawn in the summertime. Once the microbes and everything have broken that organic matter down, they've now integrated it into the soil profile and broken it down into its basic elements to be used for plant absorption. And that's going to be your stabilized organic matter. If you've ever dug a hole in the ground, if you look at that top layer, if you have healthy organic matter, you're going to see like a thick, rich, dark layer up there. That's going to be your humus. And then finally, living organisms are also soil organic matter. They have a really important function for breaking down organic matter and recycling it, but they also are a source of nutrients in themselves. So Jay's going to play this video, and I'm going to talk while you guys can look at it for a little bit. This is one of my favorite videos, the process of bioturbation. And so what you're looking at on the right side is a slide with all the microorganisms and the bacteria, the fungus, and all of our soil biota, our soil fauna. And then the other side, the left slide, is an example with none of those creatures except a bit of fungus that they have left in the soil in the leaf profile. And you can just see the important job that our soil fauna does to integrate our organic matter into the soil, into the ground below. And you can see as they're doing it, and the worms and all the critters are also creating pore space. They're actually changing the texture of the soil into something we call an aggregate. When you put your hands in the soil and let it, like all that crumbly texture, that's the texture we want to shoot for with soil, is really in part accomplished by the soil fauna underneath of us. And some scientists estimate that about 1/4 of life on Earth is within our soil profile. And so we are even recognizing just now how important it is to think of soil as a living ecosystem and how important it is to maintain it so that we can also facilitate good habitat for all our soil fauna so that they can do their job, and which in turn helps us with our soil health.
Great, Megan. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the King Conservation District's soil nutrient testing program. So maybe many of you have participated in this program already, but for folks that haven't, we do offer a free soil testing program, and we offer 5 soil tests for free for every resident within the conservation district. So whether you're a homeowner, a farm owner, or if you just are renting a pea patch, you can participate in our program. And it's 5, and that's kind of a lifetime. So we'll kind of collect your name and address, and we kind of log it by address. And soil testing is a great way to either sleuth kind of plant problems. So whether your vegetables aren't growing quite as vigorously or putting on as much fruit or vegetables as you would like, or if plants are dying or they're just not doing very well, doing a soil test can help kind of figure out or do some detective work to try and figure out if a nutrient deficiency is causing that problem. A soil test won't tell you if there's too much sun or too little sun, you've overwatered, you've underwatered, or in the case of like my tomatoes this last year, it just wasn't warm enough, long enough to put on a good crop. And so a soil test can't help with those things, but it can determine, did I put not enough nutrients, is my pH, and all the things we'll talk about later today, whether they were a problem. Now, if you're outside our district, you can still use get soil tests. You could just send them to the lab or any soil testing lab that that you would like. We use A&L Labs. They're down in Portland, and the tests are about $35 each. And so you could work with them directly. If you've done more than 5, so you're over, you can also just pay for the test and we'll ship them down with our regular shipments. Generally, we ship them on Thursday. So if you get them to us either by mailing or drop them off, we love having folks drop soil tests off and come down and say hi in our office in Renton. And you can go to our website. You found this soil webinar, so just go to kingcd.org and follow the links to the soil testing program. So not only is the soil testing program great for sleuthing problems, it's also good for determining, how well you did at the end of the growing season. Maybe you added some fertilizer, you harvested some sort of crop, and doing a fall soil test is a good way to see, well, did I apply too much? And then I can think about applying less next year. And so it's a good way to kind of determine that end of season. If you're looking to test for this year's production, spring, late winter, early spring is a good time to test for this year's season of vegetable growing. Oh, gotta click over here. Now, how to take a soil sample? We need about 3 pounds. So that's kind of a half of a gallon Ziploc bag. One soil sample might be made up of 10 subsamples. And like the little drawing has, you want to take multiple subsample of an area. That way you get a composite sample. You get a little bit from multiple spots. Because if you only take from one spot, what are the chances that that one spot represents an entire area you want to kind of manage? So one sample made up of multiple subsample. You can kind of see the graphic on the bottom left. You'll want to dig a hole if you're using a shovel, and then take a small slice. And this says about a 1/2 inch. So a 1/2 inch or an inch, it doesn't have to be perfect. You should probably be consistent. So if you're taking an inch, take an inch from all the different spots. Go about the same depth. Depending on the time of year, you want to capture soil from 0 inches to 12 inches. Sometimes a little bit shallower, 2 inches. And honestly, if you can't always dig the whole 12 inches, or 6 inches, just do your best and try to be consistent all throughout the sampling area. You take those multiple subsamples, you put them in a clean bucket, and then out of that bucket of soil, you take out the 3 pounds. On the Ziploc bag, label it with your name and put like the area. So if it's the front lawn, if it's your raised beds, some, short name that you can remember where that sample's from. Now, if you're interested in doing multiple samples, you might choose to take samples if you want to test your lawn and your veggie garden. Those 2 areas are managed pretty differently. So what you've put in the veggie garden might change every year. Certainly the crop is different. So you would want to take multiple subsamples from the veggie garden, make that one sample, multiple samples from the lawn, make that one sample. Or ornamental garden, or this part of the lawn is really low and wet. This part of the lawn is always high and dry. And so those might be 2 samples. If you're going to manage it all the same, well, then you could probably just take 1 sample of all the areas. So that's how to take a soil sample. Once you've collected your soil sample, you would go to our website, get this form. This is our soil information sheet. And basically it has a place for you to put your name, your phone number, address, email, and then the sample information. That small name, backyard 1, front lawn 2, raised beds, ornamental garden. And then put your crop. It's real important to put the fewest number of crops. If you're raising grass, that's pretty easy, lawn grass. If you put something like blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, and lettuce, that confuses the lab. The nutrient requirements for blueberries and lettuce are probably pretty different. So if you put a whole host of different crops, they're going to pick one, and it might not represent what all of those plants need. They do have like a mixed vegetables, so if you're growing multiple things, you just put vegetables, and they'll just pick an average. Once you get this filled out, like I said, drop them off at our office, put them in the US Post Office or UPS, get it down to us pretty quick. We put all the samples in a refrigerator to kind of cool them down before we ship them down to our partner lab in Portland. Now I'll pass it back to Megan.
Oh, thank you. I'll share the microphone and pass back and forth. Understanding soil test results. So we're going to break down a typical soil test, one that you'd receive from us if you use our free soil testing program, but it can be similar to like other labs in terms of what results you're getting at. So this is a typical test results page. This whole presentation was actually kind of born out of folks taking soil tests and then getting this results page back and be feeling overwhelmed and really needing some help deciphering it. And what we realized was that if we help you break this down and kind of understand what you're looking at, it really empowers you to kind of have a good understanding about what your soil needs are and a basic understanding of how to hopefully feel empowered to keep managing in a more detailed way for your soil health. I don't know if Jay mentioned this before, but one of the reasons we give out free soil tests is because we want to help you dial in what you're applying to your soil and a big reason for not over applying. So that if you over apply and we get a big rainstorm, then you have nutrients washing off into our waterways. And the bulk of our large river systems and smaller tributaries often have pollution issues in part because of too many nutrients. And so a lot of our work is trying to keep those nutrients out of the water. And so hopefully this helps you empower you to kind of manage that better, but also not waste nutrients or not waste money on purchasing fertilizer and then over applying. So it really helps empower you to kind of be really dialed in on what you're doing. So from here, I'm going to break down each part of this. So in the next slide, I'll start with organic matter. And this soil test, it's high organic matter, not uncommon in our area at all, especially if you're regularly applying like a general fertilizer or nutrient source like composted fertilizer or something like that. Organic matter, you kind of want it to be between a 2 and a 5 on the test result. If you have high organic matter levels, though you don't want to add more. You actually want to encourage the decomposition of what's there. And to do that, you want to ensure microbial populations are present in the soil to help break that up. So you can add a small amount of compost because there's going to be microbes in there that will help boost that activity. You can also purchase and apply a soil inoculant, which is beneficial bacteria. And you also want to monitor your nitrogen levels because if you have low nitrogen, there's not going to be enough nutrients for the microbes there to be powered to break down that organic matter. And the reason this is a negative thing is because if you have too much organic matter, especially if it's like a carbon-based one, like wood chips or mulch, The microbes have to work so hard to break that down. They're actually using up all the nutrients that you want to keep in like your garden or your lawn or wherever you're trying to manage. And so there can, in some senses, be too much of a good thing. But just to reiterate, organic matter is so important for living soil. It adds to food resources, helps soil absorb water and maintain water moisture, provides shelter, and creates airspace within the soil. So it's important, but you don't want to have too much of it. So the next is nitrogen, which is low on this test, also very common for our area. We'll talk more about why that is, but essentially you'll see the lab test for nitrogen up top, what the results are in your soil, and then below the lab is recommending 3.1 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. So that's kind of like a ratio for a garden about how much you'd want to add. And then phosphorus. Phosphorus is another big one. You'll see the lab results and the lab recommendations there. I also just want to touch on, it says phosphorus in 2 columns, and one has a value and one does not. That is because it's actually hard to extract phosphorus out of soil to test for it. And they have to pick a test based on the pH of the soil. And for acidic soils, you run the weak Bray test. So you only have one result for phosphorus. You're not missing anything in that other column. Next we have potassium, and you'll see the lab results and the lab recommendations below. And so now we're going to talk about all 3 of them. So these are called our macronutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. We call it NPK for short. These are the nutrients you have to put back into the soil in large quantities to kind of encourage plant growth. Nitrogen's critical for plant growth, especially when I think like the green leafy matter in a plant. You really need nitrogen for that. One cool type of plant are legumes that can fix atmospheric nitrogen. So that means if you plant a legume, like a pea or a clover or a vetch or a trefoil, they'll actually take the nitrogen in the atmosphere and integrate it through their roots and pump it into the soil. So they're putting nitrogen into the soil for you. And you'll see if you pick them up, like if you have a crimson clover growing in the summertime and you take it out of the ground, it'll have little nodules all over the root system. And it's part of its process for putting that nitrogen back into the soil profile. The nitrate form of nitrogen, which is one of the usable forms for plants, can leach through soil. And so when we have all this rain that we have in the wintertime, all this rain is leaching that nitrogen through the soil profile. Another reason we don't want to over-apply nitrogen, because that is a pollution risk. So we don't want that to happen. Ammonium nitrogen, which is a form of nitrogen in the soil, can also be lost to the atmosphere. So if you're tilling your soil up and that ammonium hits the air, it volatilizes and it turns into a gas form, and then you also lose it. Phosphorus plays a vital role in plant production, essential for fruit and seed production. So if you're thinking like big juicy tomatoes or broccoli or anything that you want to be productive, you want to make sure you have good phosphorus levels. It's also not a mobile nutrient, so it binds to soil and usually doesn't leach like nitrogen does the soil profile. It becomes very unavailable. It really likes to bind to things when the soil is really acidic or basic, or alkaline is another word for that. But if you're not managing your soil well and you're having soil erosion issues, it can get into the water that way. And that's a huge pollution problem as well. It creates big algal blooms, and it kind of can help dissolve all the oxygen out of the water, which is really bad for salmon. So we don't want those things, either of those nutrients, getting into our water. And then we have potassium, which is kind of a general overall important nutrient for a vast array of physiological processes in plants. Organic matter holds and releases potassium in the soil. It's also called potash, and not generally considered a pollution problem the way phosphorus and nitrogen are. The next 3 nutrients on your soil test result are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And so you'll see the results there, and then the lab results below. You might be wondering, why isn't there a calcium category in the fertility guidelines? And that's because calcium is, the ratios of calcium in the soil are managed by adding lime or dolomite. And we're going to talk more about that in a second. The other thing I just want to make a note of on this is that sodium is listed here. And there are no known quantities of sodium that you need in soil. So we're not trying to don't add salt to your soil. Some parts of the country intrinsically have high sodium content in their soil, like the Dakotas and things like that, but we want to keep sodium low. So those are our secondary nutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. So calcium plays a key role in plant cell walls. Magnesium plays a critical role in photosynthesis, and sulfur is a component in protein development. I did forget to mention also in the last slide, I just found out the lab no longer tests for sulfur like it does for calcium, magnesium on the soil test. So we're gonna have to update that. But occasionally there you can have sulfur deficiencies. These are pictures of amendments that you can buy at any local hardware store. So to add calcium, you can just add pellets. I can never say that word, but like powdered lime. Or if you want to add a magnesium component with the calcium, you can get dolomite lime. Dolomite lime has magnesium and calcium in it. And you can also buy 50-pound bags of sulfur. So tied to calcium and magnesium is your pH. And our soils are natural historic forest soils, which were naturally acidic. And so it's not uncommon to see something like a 5.6 level of pH on a soil test. And then again, to kind of reiterate, then that is tied to adding lime or dolomite lime back to your soil to raise that pH up. We're going to talk more about pH in a second in the next slide. So jumping a little bit into soil chemistry, we mentioned how phosphorus likes to bind to things in really acidic or alkaline environments. And so this chart just shows how your soil pH really affects plants' abilities to access nutrients in your soil. So when your soil is really acidic, nitrogen and phosphorus and all those elements like to bind to other things and become unavailable to plants. But if you're able to raise that pH up by adding lime or dolomite lime, it kind of unbinds those elements and now the plants can absorb those. So I kind of say it's like taking advantage of all the nutrients that are already in your soil profile without having to add more. And if you're wondering like what kind of pH to shoot for, soil scientists say for like a plant or like a vegetable garden, a 6.5 is an optimal soil pH level. But don't be upset if your pH is in the 5 range. That's very common in our area. So you saw back on the original soil test, there was a bunch of categories that were empty, and those were our micronutrients or trace elements. Iron, manganese, boron, chloride, zinc, copper, and now the lab has now moved sulfur into this category as well. We call them our micronutrients though because they're not needed in large quantities, but they are crucial for plant growth. If you're really having an issue with a plant or you're trying to be very specific in your cultivation of a plant and you're worried you are having issues, a plant tissue analysis is actually more reliable for micronutrients than soil testing. And you can do that. You can send a plant tissue, a piece of tissue to the lab for them to test for these things for you. But in general, if you're regularly applying just a basic organic matter like composted manure or cover crops, they're a good source of micronutrients. So I wouldn't expect to have deficiencies. Although we have worked with master gardeners that have found micro deficiencies like boron or something in their plant. This test is not included in our basic soil analysis package, but you're welcome to add it for an additional charge if you'd like to. Okay, cation exchange capacities. This is the last part of the soil test to kind of break down and probably the trickiest to explain because we're diving a little more into soil chemistry. But so essentially you'll see the cation exchange capacity number. Go back one sec, Jay. Right there. So this person has a 4.6, which is on the lower end, but also common for our area. And then on the right side, you'll have the percentage of cation exchange capacity. So those are the elements that are being, which will make more sense in a second in the next slide, but what are kind of like being all the nutrients that are around the soil. Well, I'll explain it better in the next slide. So cation exchange capacity and soil characteristics. So we're going back to our soil texture triangle that we talked about earlier. Clay particles in soil have a charge, and the way that nutrients kind of bind to soil are that soil, all those elements that have been broken down from organic matter have a charge, and our soil has a charge. Those clay particles have a charge. And so every different soil texture has a different amount of charge or cation exchange capacity. Some people use the analogy of how many parking spots your soil has for nutrients to park in. And this analogy is like a pantry. So sandy soils don't have a lot of clay component. They can't store a ton of nutrients. So it's like having a small pantry. So if you have a small pantry in your house, there's a limited amount of food that you can hold there. As the soil texture changes and you have more clay component, like a silty soil, you've got that medium cation exchange capacity. So your pantry size has now gone up. And then the next arrow. So then soil that has a heavy clay component, you're going to have a lot of humus, a lot of organic matter. You're going to have the highest cation exchange capacity, like the biggest pantry that you can have. And so in a sense, one way to think about this is, I don't want it to feel like there's like a right or wrong cation exchange capacity to have. Instead, it's just if you have a small pantry and you can't store a lot of nutrients, you just have to go to the store more often. Which in meaning that if you're adding nutrients to a soil with low cation exchange capacity, you can't dump a whole ton of nutrients in that soil. There's just not space for the soil to hold on to it. So you're just going to want to throughout the season add nutrients so that, as that pantry gets emptied out. Or soils with a higher clay soil, you can add a whole lot of nutrients at once, and that soil has the ability to actually hold on to those nutrients. So hopefully that makes sense for everyone. I was just gonna say that you can't really control, though it's really intrinsic to your soil texture. So while the lab puts it on there, I wouldn't worry about it. There's not a lot you can do. It's really tied to your soil type. Mm-hmm.
Well, great, Megan. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we've taken our soil sample and now we've kind of read our soil test report. And now I'm going to go through, well, now what? I have the soil test. I sort of understand what numbers I need to shoot for. But now, how do I take that to make some amendment to my soil? So like Megan referred to, on the bottom of the soil test is the soil fertility guidelines. And this is the part of the soil test where the lab has taken the organic matter, all the nutrients, and the pH, and is now making recommendations to you. What they're not doing is saying, put 5 pounds of this very specific nutrient or this product down. But what they are saying is, here's for a crop of vegetables. Now, if you put vegetables down, or if you put ornamental garden, or if you put your lawn, they're going to make recommendations for that crop. So for the vegetable crop, and then the next piece you want to look at is the rate. This is pounds per 1,000 square feet. Some of the results we get back are in pounds per acre. So you might have to convert in order to follow what I'm going to show you from pounds per acre into pounds per 1,000 square feet. And essentially you divide the number by 43.56 to get pounds per 1,000. And underneath, we go through all the recommended, types of nutrients that they're recommending. And this is pounds per 1,000 square feet. So the first column, they're recommending dolomite, and that's to adjust the pH. 210 pounds of dolomite per 1,000 square feet. We have 3.1 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000. Phosphate is 2 pounds, potash is 3, and sulfur 0.6. So when looking at a fertilizer, all fertilizers, whether they're organic or inorganic, natural or synthetic, anything that is a fertilizer will have a guaranteed analysis. And typically there's 3 numbers. And those numbers correspond to our macronutrients, NPK. And it's actually nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. It's not phosphorus and potassium. So those two nutrients, that was how they were kind of recognized in the phosphate form and the potash. So that's kind of carried over. So a product that's labeled 10-10-10 is 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphate, and 10% potash. So if we were to purchase a 50-pound bag, we would get 5 pounds of each of those nutrients. Now, if we had an 18-18-18, instead of being 10%, it's 18%. So instead of being, right, 5 pounds of each of those in a 50-pound bag, it would be 9 pounds, which is 50%. So how do we determine how much we need? So when you send in a soil sample, I'll send out a couple fact sheets and kind of calculator tools. And so the first step in determining what you need is first kind of get down to your actual garden size. And so in this example, our raised beds for the sample I sent in are really only 100 square feet. So what we want to do is kind of make what we call the garden proportion. So, right, my garden is 10 feet by 10 feet. That's 100 square feet. So then we take 100 square feet and we divide by that rate in pounds per thousand to get kind of our garden proportion. So here, right, we're only looking for 10% of that 3.1 pounds because we only have 100 square feet. So our garden proportion is 0.1 or, right, 10%. Now we're going to pick our supplement. Now picking supplements can be real tricky. First of all, not every store has every product. Second, there are a lot of products out there. There are organic products, there are inorganic. Like I said, there's natural, there's synthetic. We're choosing blood meal here, but blood meal is made out of dried blood. So if you're a vegan, you may not want to use blood meal. Maybe you want to use something else. Blood meal is actually, fairly decent product. It's fast acting, and it's a repurposed, waste product. It's 13% nitrogen. All different nutrients, all different products will have that guaranteed analysis, and so some might have more or less depending on what they are. This one is 13%, so we're going to put the 13 here, and then we're going to multiply it by 0.01, or like we're dividing by 100 to kind of put it into percent form, right? 13% or 0.13. So we have our kind of garden proportion, which was 0.1. Now we're looking at our product, and it has a nitrogen content of 0.13. Now we're going to determine how much nitrogen we need in the 100 square foot. So we take from our soil test 3.1, we multiply that by our garden proportion. And so instead of 3.1 pounds per thousand, we need 0.31 pounds of actual nitrogen. So we put that in the bottom here. We need 0.31. Now, if we had 1,000 square feet, we could skip the whole garden proportion and we'd put 3.1. However, we'll just go with 100 square feet. We take that 0.31 pounds of nitrogen. We divide that by the content in the product, the percent, 0.13. And in this case, we need 2.4 pounds of fertilizer or pounds of blood meal to meet the nutrient requirements that the lab recommended. If we think about our cation exchange capacity now, if we had a real sandy soil and a low CEC value, we would definitely want to divide this into 3 applications, which is a good idea anyway to slowly feed your plants over the growing season, but certainly on a sandy soil with a low CEC value. There's lots of things out on the web that can help you determine products, that can help you to have calculators. If you're using our soil test service, I include a calculator. We include a paper calculator that you can do math very similar to what you just saw. You could follow the same thing for the phosphate and the potash. You would just pick a different product. Some products have all 3. Some products only have 2. And of course, some products have 1. So you might have to pick and choose. At a minimum, you don't want to over apply nitrogen. Nitrogen, like Megan said, tends to leach. It can leach with water in the winter. It can turn into a gas if it's too hot. It's a very mobile element in the soil. So if you're going to use a product with multiple, N, P, and K in them, always kind of base it on the nitrogen, or pick products that have 1 of each, and you can pick and choose. I do want to just mention a little bit about using compost as a fertilizer. Not all compost is the same. Compost is derived of feedstocks. So they all tend to have a little bit of N, P, and K, but the numbers, the percentages can vary. And when you buy compost, you don't get a guaranteed analysis, right? A lot of composts have a lot of wood or sawdust. Even if you're buying manure or getting manure from a farm, it might have a lot of bedding. So it may not actually provide a lot of nutrients. It really just depends on what it's made from. So compost, right, is great material, provides lots of benefits, but we shouldn't always rely on it to provide all of the nutrients. And if you are going to do that, it may be worth it to get a compost test and see what it is that you're actually applying. Because the last thing you want to do is over apply the compost, add a lot of that carbon, have a lot of that extra microbial activity that actually can bind the nutrients. And it sort of takes all the nitrogen into its processes or their processes, and then you don't have any left for your veggies. Of course, manures can have bacteria on them, so you want to be real careful when applying raw manures to fresh vegetable crops because it can make you sick. And then you do want to be careful of applying compost or manures right before a big rain event because that material can leach. At the KCD, we house a program called Manure Match. And this is a way that we connect people that have, manure or compost with people that might want it. And so it's on our website, and we have farms that have stockpiles of compost and manure in various states. Some of it's fresh, some of it's composted, some of it does have a lot of organic matter, some of it has a little, but we just kind of host the site, and then you could get on there and kind of look for someplace that's close to you, and you could bring a pickup, you could bring a dumping trailer, or plastic bags. A lot of the farmers will work with people. They shouldn't be charging, and if they do charge, it's just a nominal fee, and mostly to help you load it. I do want to add a little bit about dolomite and lime, and this is the product that we recommend for raising the soil pH. And again, soil pH is tied to nutrient availability. So if you're applying nutrients to a low pH soil, you might actually be wasting some of that nutrient. So you do want to take care to manage your pH if it's low. And there's really two liming agents, dolomite and limestone. Dolomite is a calcium and magnesium, calcium carbonate and magnesium carbonate, and it's about 50-50%. And limestone is really calcium carbonate. So it will only supply the calcium, whereas dolomite supplies both magnesium and calcium. So the lab will decide whether you need dolomite or lime, depending on how high or low your magnesium levels are. We'll just touch a little bit on cover crops. There is a lot of information out there on cover crops. And essentially what a cover crop is, it's a plant that you either plant at the end of the growing season, or plants that are planted, early or during the growing season. And the idea is that we're trying to put a vegetative cover on, your crop ground. And there's a number of reasons why you might cover crop, but certainly winter cover crops can help prevent soil erosion from wind and water. It can actually help raise the temperature of the soil by creating kind of a green insulated layer. That green mass, right? You're letting it decompose on the soil, and if you're doing tillage, you're mixing the plants into the soil, so you can kind of increase some soil organic matter. In the fall, some cover crops, the legumes, they can actually fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into the soil over the winter and early spring. It can provide some of the nutrients, nitrogen in particular, for the next growing season. But those cover crops can also scavenge excess nutrients that may have been left over after the growing season, so they will get eroded. Biodiversity, right? You can see the pollinators on there. So they provide kind of some of that wildlife habitat and food for our pollinator friends. Can help suppress weeds and kind of keep soil moisture by keeping those living roots in the soil. And of course, those living roots can break up and minimize soil compaction. So we just want to end with a couple take-home thoughts, right? You do want to be careful about organic matter. Like we've said, organic matter is great material. You don't want too little and you don't want too much. Nitrogen, very important for plant growth, but again, over applying can cause either leaching or cause it to turn into a gas and leave the system. So you want to make sure you're managing your nitrogen levels. As equally important is managing our pH, our soil, reducing soil acidity, right? Acid soils, the plants can't absorb nutrients as effectively. So you want to be very mindful of what your pH is. And lastly, you don't have to fix everything at once. Gardening is an adventure, and it's done a lot by trial and error. So if you try one thing, just focus on one or two things. If you get a soil test report and it has all these problems, go through it real slowly and kind of fix things one at a time. That way you're not kind of overwhelmed. So those are our take-home thoughts. And so this is Megan and my email and cell phone number. So we'll leave this up for a little bit, but feel free to give us a call, shoot us an email if you have any questions. Please feel free to take advantage of our soil testing program. And we're here to help. And that's our presentation for tonight. Any questions?
Well, we'll get started. So the first question we have is, how long do you leave fallen leaves on the garden until they disappear, or do you remove them in the summer?
I love this question. I'll go. I was gonna in the chat, and I also can give it to Mylon to send out. There's a great TED talk that I love about composting leaves. The best thing you can do if you're gonna use leaves, if you can chop them up, that helps a lot to help break them down because they're hard to break down. So that'll help speed that process up of using those nutrients. Was that question more geared towards like leaving them as like a layer over the garden or using them as nutrients?
My understanding reading it was like leaving them as a layer as like mulch, and if you want to clarify that question in the chat, go for it. We can always come back to it if we need to.
Of course,
Yeah,
there's also lots of science coming out on the benefits of leaves in a garden as being insect habitat.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, a bunch of us grew up on the East Coast, and I certainly made money in the fall raking leaves, and that was sort of instilled in me is to rake leaves in the fall. But certainly, those leaves provide all sort of microclimates for insects and other invertebrates. And so they're saying just leave the leaves in your landscape. Of course, it's sort of hard to, especially when we're sort of programmed to have neat, tidy gardens, but there's all sort of benefits.
Yeah, you can leave them and you just till them in the spring and chop them in. That's a nutrient source.
And it looks like we got some clarification. Wanted to know the benefits of bugs helping to amend the soil, etc.
Yeah, I mean, bugs is a broad word, but certainly insects in general are a macro fauna and certainly an important part of the nutrient cycle. Like they will, depending on the actual type of insect, like they will be the first layer of decomposers for that organic matter. Of course, there's some insects that eat other insects, uh, just like every food web. It's just an important part of the cycle, and so they might be the first critter to break down organic matter, and then that goes to the earthworms, and then that goes to the next smaller, piece.
So, kind of continuing on that, actually, our next question was, should you add worms to your garden? And specifically red wigglers, even though they're non-native.
Well, earthworms are technically non-native as well, and so, but we all promote earthworms. If you don't have a lot of worm activity, certainly adding worms to a garden is going to be helpful. Again, they're a macro kind of invertebrate, large animal relatively compared to like bacteria, which are really small. Probably most important, is having the right amount of organic matter. So if you're going to add earthworms, you also want to make sure you're in that 4 to 6% organic matter as well, because that will kind of, kick start that whole microbial activity within the soil. I wouldn't get hung up on not seeing any worms, because if you have the right habitat, they will come. So just making sure that you have the other parts of the habitat as well as the worms themselves.
This is an interesting follow-up to that question as well. Is it true that earthworms are invasive and basically didn't exist in North America until the European explorers brought them? This must have affected a huge change in ecology. Uh, I can say that there are many, many species of worms that are native to North America. Um, if we're talking about like garden variety worms, I do not know, but I would assume that there are probably several species that were brought in with people throughout history. If anybody else wants to elaborate.
I don't know about for the entire country, but I know earthworms are not native to this area, although they are abundant. I don't know if Jay, you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, they're like many other species. They may be invasive, but they're not noxious or obnoxious like our friend or enemy, the blackberry. So we've sort of accepted them as part of our soil ecosystem. So I wouldn't worry too much about controlling the worms. There are likely other plants or there's other things to eliminate from the garden, like your garden variety weeds.
Cool. Up next from Tom, can you discuss how tilling affects networks of fungus in soil? Is it true that tilling ends up disrupting beneficial organisms in the soil?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that happens when you're tilling is that you destroy the soil texture. And after you've tilled, you notice when you pick up soil, it's real platey, we call it. It's been like thick and compacted. So now there isn't space for microorganisms to live. And then another thing that happens after you till is now you've exposed all that soil to the sun. And so now it's going to get baked and it's going to heat up. It's going to be kind of inhospitable to microorganisms. And so you're kind of doing a twofold negative impact on soil health.
The soil structure gets ruined too.
Yeah.
So all like we saw in the video, that those earthworm or the worms were creating little pathways and there's lots of pathways that we're not seeing because they're micropores. That whole system gets destroyed. You just mentioned fungus, those fungus hyphae, they're creating little pathways and networks, and extensive tillage really ruins all of those pathways. Those hyphae are important nutrient transfer. They're hosts for microbial microbes, bacteria live along the hyphae and the roots. Yeah, so we're just finding out more and more about how tillage is not good for soil health. Does it mean you should never till? Well, I mean, we've been tilling gardens and croplands for a really long time. And although it's not great for soil health, the way I kind of look at it as, it's a tool in a tool belt, right? We have herbicides, we have, we have tillage, we have a hula hoe, I have my hands. And sometimes we have to choose to use a tool. And, so tillage might be one of them, but you want to keep it at a minimum. Someone in the chat wrote about, mixing in of cover crops. What I've been doing is I'll put, of course, another tool, black plastic in the spring. So I'll grow my cover crops all winter. And then in the, like a month before I'm ready to plant, I cut the cover crop, or if it's big enough, I'll whack the cover crop. I'll get out with my garden shears and I'll cut the cover crop. And then I'll put black plastic down. And it's sort of, I'll say it melts, but it doesn't really melt. It sort of, turbocharges the decomposition. So then I don't have to do the tillage. I don't have to mix it in. It just takes a little getting used to. It's a whole different type of gardening. It's no till or reduced till. And so you're going to have to change how you garden if you decide to do that. I'll tell you what, I love a fresh tilled patch of, garden bed. There's something that's just appealing, that it's perfect. It's, everything's mixed in, all the weeds are gone, but it's just like aesthetics. So you just have to choose a different methodology.
Cool. Speaking of aesthetics, we're actually going to skip. We'll come back to these questions, but Tom asks, plenty of moss grows in and among the grass in my yard. Is that bad in any way or an indicator of something negative? I like the moss because of its filtering properties for the air, and it does not bother me aesthetically.
I mean, a weed is just a plant out of place. So if you don't mind the moss, there you go. Don't mind it. It's green. Looks like lawn from afar. I mean, if you're dead set on getting rid of moss, well, we're in the Northwest. We are in the land of mosses. It's actually pretty hard to control moss. It can be a sign of acidic soils. It tends to grow better in soils that are a little bit more acidic. It tends to grow better in the shade. It, yeah, moisture. Someone wrote it's a sign of moisture and shade. It tends to grow better when you cut your lawn really short. So, but I mean, it's a native plant. So if you don't mind the moss, it's not really a sign of anything bad. And so let it be. It's actually pretty hard to successfully eliminate moss unless you're willing to prescribe to a pretty intensive either chemical or mechanical removal. Um,
Well, Carrie asks, should you still add compost if your soil test comes out well balanced in terms of nutrients?
well, I would just say, how's the organic matter level? If your organic matter level is in, above 6%, you probably don't want to add very much. It's like, why are you adding organic matter? The soil already has enough. And what I would say is we should get away from adding inches of organic matter and start to add like sub-inch, quarter inch. That's probably a pretty good application if you're not too much above 5 or 6.
So this is more of a general question in terms of turning in soil samples. When you turn in a soil sample, is it helpful to note on that soil sample that it came from an organic garden?
It doesn't matter. Yeah.
That would just come into your decision making on how you want to amend that garden, what products you want to use.
Yeah, the lab, it's not going to make a difference to the lab because at the end of the day, the laboratory tests, the being or an organic garden or a non-organic garden, the laboratory tests can't really tell.
Laura asks, I understand that if you're already growing blueberries and lettuce, you'd want to provide 2 soil samples. But if you're starting with a fairly consistent plot area about to be planted with, say, blueberries and lettuce, can the testing company provide a grid of unique targets? If so, what's the right way to state that on the form so that they don't just pick one? Or if you know of a resource that lists targets for different plants or crops, that might be even better.
Yeah, that's a good
Uh,
question. Oh, go ahead,
Go
Jay.
ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say you're just gonna need to take 2 different samples there because the pH level recommendations and everything for blueberries is a lot different than what you're gonna want for lettuce. So you just want to do like 2 little micro samples, so take enough soil from each of those areas to get something tailored to what you're gonna want on the lab test results.
And, it's just a matter of scale too, right? The soil test company is like we send 1,500 soil tests to them a year. So they can't like spend a lot of time on one sample and do multiple iterations. However, there's probably some good online, uh, there are good online recommendations for like pH and nutrients. So even though you might say, I want to grow lettuce in this area, but you're right, we can search online and we can look and be, oh, well, blueberries need a 5.6, right? And so even though our soil test, we asked for lettuce, we turned it in, and now we know we have a 6.0, and it's going to make a recommendation for lettuce to add some lime. But we can just look up and be like, okay, blueberries need a little bit more acidic or fine at 6. And then so that part we don't have to really do things.
Cool. What optimal CEC levels do we need for healthy soil?
Good question. I think if you could control it, which we really can, you can add organic matter to your soil profile, and slowly over time, over many, many years, you might be able to move that needle up a little bit, but you're really kind of restricted by your soil type there. I think it's a 20, if I remember correctly, is around what, if you could control it, would be a real ideal cation exchange capacity. But for the most part, all our soils are on the lower end. So that just means you're going to want to, meter out your nutrients and keep adding nutrients to your garden or your lawn throughout the season.
Yeah, I think it's more of a cation exchange capacity in itself is not a measure of healthy or unhealthy soil. It's just a statement of it is this. Therefore, because it's either a low, medium, or high, these are the conditions that you have. And then you have to do something based on the conditions you have. You add small amounts of nutrients multiple times per the year, or you can add a whole bunch at once.
Yeah, and I didn't mention this in the presentation, but if you had a really high cation exchange capacity and a ton of clay in your soil, you've actually got new problems now, because now with all that clay, that soil was going to be wet and mucky all the time. And so now that's going to be your limiter, is that you don't have enough air in your soil. You're kind of dealing with almost like, it starts to creep towards wetland type soils. And so then, there's kind of that sweet spot. If you're lucky enough, especially in the areas around here, if you have soil that was from like old like river soils historically, those are real rich. That's why along the Snoqualmie River and stuff, that's like our most productive areas in the county, because they have all that silty loam soil.
And I just want to hop in real quick. We have about 7 minutes left, so we're probably not going to get to all of the questions, but I'm going to ask Megan and Jay if you guys could answer some via in written form, and I can send them out in email later. But we have a time for a few more now, so I'll stop talking.
Okay. I guess with that being said, I would like to get to some of the more technical questions just while we have everybody here in person. So Steve asks, does blood meal have anything in the 87% not nitrogen that might be detrimental to the soil's health?
That's a good question. It's something to think about for sure on all the fertilizers, right? Because they are 30, or in this case, 87% non-nitrogen. A lot of times fertilizers don't actually list, because it's proprietary, what the other percentage material is. So it's hard to say exactly, but honestly, like, these are products that people, like companies, are selling as a fertilizer. Obviously, they have some sort of testing that goes on. Certainly, they're not good for people to eat, but they wouldn't be selling a product that's unhealthy in general for soil, for plants. Yeah, they wouldn't be selling them if they had some toxic attributes. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about the other 87%.
Cool. So Joe asks, what are the best ways to apply any needed soil amendments in a young orchard? Do you apply a certain amount to the soil under each tree?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, depending on how large your orchard is, right? You just want to take that, pounds per thousand, or right, pounds per acre. You just want to fine tune that. Are you only applying around the drip line of the plant? Well, is that 10 square feet per plant? But yeah, you could surface apply most things. I mean, it does take a little while for it to work its way down into the soil profile. It really depends on the product, on the speed at which it's available. But like blood meal is pretty readily available to plants, and so it winds up getting absorbed pretty quickly. But there's others that are much slower.
On a side note, I've noticed like with my fruit tree throughout the year too, it really likes having multiple fertilizer applications throughout the year. I get a ton of production that way. So in terms of when you're incorporating it.
All right. Katie asks, is mint a variable cover crop? And I will defer this to you, Jay, but I'm pretty sure technically yes, but it's very hard to keep it contained.
I can speak from experience on this one. It's fun to weed because it smells wonderful as you're pulling it out, but I leave it in because I like to grow catnip every year, so I leave some, but it takes over. And you have to be really careful because it can jump out of your garden bed and then get places where you don't want it to be. If you don't mind how vigorous it is, it's happy to be there. I don't think it's the best at stabilizing soil as some of our other cover crops that you can plant, but you have to watch out for that.
I've recently worked with several plant and soil scientists, and we went through every single cover crop that could be planted in the Northwest, and mint was not one of them. So I don't know if it is really a plant that people are using as a cover crop itself. Well, one, depending on the species, it's invasive, so that there's that. But I don't know if it has a lot of characteristics that we would look for in a plant that we would call a cover crop.
I don't find it to have a very expansive root system. That was my thing with it in terms of, but I'm all for promoting from learning about soil like ugly gardens. And if you have it and you just want to leave it in there over the winter and versus pulling it out and having bare soil, I totally recommend that. Mm-hmm. Cool. That's what I do.
I guess for our probably what might end up being our final question, I'll kind of continue on the cover crop theme. So regarding cover crop, mine is very healthy. What do I do in the spring when I'm ready to plant if tilling is not very beneficial? Should I plant between the cover crop, pull it up, chop it?
Yeah, like I was sharing in my raised beds, I usually either mow it or I use some garden shears and I cut it down to the ground, and then I'll cover it in plastic for 4 to 6 weeks, and kind of time that to when I'm going to be planting my starts or my seeds, and that will give it time to decompose, and then it's kind of acts sort of as a surface mulch, as well as some of it does work its way into the soil through that microbial soil activity.
All right. I guess might have time to answer one more question. I guess Carol asked, please repeat the comment made about ammonium sulfate as an additive. Is it an organic additive?
Ammonium sulfate is probably not an organic additive, and it's one of those things where there's lots of products out there. There are ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, and you'll just have to decide what makes sense for you in your garden and for either the food or the plants that you're growing. What type of product makes sense for you?
Right, and that is just about time. So, folks, anybody who did not have their question answered, we will try and send up a follow-up email getting you some of that information out from some of our folks here. But thank you all for joining. Thank you all for your wonderful questions. And I hope you found, I think I speak for everybody where we say we hope you find the workshop informative and get something out of it.